Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nasser El-Batal, and as Paul introduced me, I will be going over TOGAF 9.2 with you. So there are some changes for those of you who are familiar with TOGAF already. There are some structural changes associated with the standard. In some cases, they're simple. In other cases, they're more complex. So this is pretty much to go over these changes and to revisit the TOGAF framework supporting your enterprise architecture for those of you who are not familiar with it to begin with. So I will minimize the GoToMeeting screen. If you do have any questions, please make sure to type them in the chat box, and Paul will let me know if there are any that I need to answer right away. Otherwise, we'll try to get to them at the end of the session. So this is all about introducing, as I mentioned, some of the changes associated with TOGAF. The program itself is what the open group, who are the governing body of the subject matter, they call this TOGAF Essentials 2018, because the changes were actually introduced in April of this year. So it's kind of almost fresh still, and certainly will affect certifications and application of the subject matter over the upcoming couple of years. Basically, they changed some of the approaches where they started to add rationale, of the change in their content and in their material. So they added quite a bit of, in quotes, comments, that will reflect on what the change is about. So an example here is that the box on the left had an old definition that is associated with 9.1. The box on the right is the new definition associated with 9.2, but excluding any notes that may have been introduced. Certain definitions have changed altogether. Other definitions have been rewritten, right? So when we're talking about actor, as an example, that's a definition that we're all familiar with that could be associated with a person, organization, or a system. An actor could be carrying one or more roles, right, and has one or more activities. So now, to clarify some of this concept, they have added certain notes, to these changes, so that makes it a little bit more, I guess, clear for everybody involved. So all of this, for those of you who are planning to either read or take any TOGAF update courses, if you are already 9.1 certified and you want to continue to be updated on what the latest and greatest in TOGAF, and you want to practice the new TOGAF, then we encourage you to get certified under what we call 9.2 Essentials. So we're going to see some of the gaps, and this is basically what you're going to be working with. So as an example, we all know TOGAF as one big standard. The publication of 9.1 is some sort of 762 pages, double-sided, that included everything and anything that the framework talked about. And very quickly they realized that this is kind of a burden to the practitioners, and they decided to change that approach from a single, a monolithic type of standards to a combination. So they decentralized, the knowledge, and now they're going to have a combination of different items. We're going to see in a second what the combination is. But for now, the one monolithic standard mixed pretty much everything. Mixed, the core, mixed the guidance, mixed the tools, techniques, mixed, everything associated with the knowledge, which became kind of a barrier to evolving the subject matter because it became too much, right? So they basically changed the approach from that one monolithic type of approach, and they broke it down to a number of different items. So they basically brought up, certain, or kept, to be more accurate, kept certain core and separated other guides or guidance, right, to a number of different publications. So as you can see now, instead of having one big TOGAF 9.1 book, they're gonna basically break it down into multiple publications that will include what we call the core, but also you would have additional publication associated with what's known to be guidelines or guiding series, right? The guiding series have undergone the same rigorous assessment that the core has followed, right? So not because we're separating them that they're going to be less important. Basically, they're still going to be as important, but rather than having everything all in one bucket, they kind of separated, some of the content to make it core, guideline, and tools and techniques. So when we're talking about the success of TOGAF, it continues to be successful with the numbers to prove and to support that, right? More than 78,000 certification, more than 7 or 8 tools that are certified by the open group as a TOGAF tool. You have some 72 plus TOGAF related training courses that are already accredited, right? Besides these numbers, the reason behind all of this is that the standard is now proven, it's known, it's followed, it's successful, it has, the supported or the supporting ecosystem to enable it. So as you can see, some additional numbers to show worldwide, and you can certainly go to the open group and capture some additional information, on that as well. This is what the TOGAF ecosystem is going to look like today. And the reason I'm saying this today is because like the TOGAF 9.2 is already in early circulation and it's being practiced, and as of the new year, all basically examination requirements going to be based on 9.2. So as you can see, there is a lot of information associated with the ecosystem. If you take a look at some of the colored boxes on the top in the middle of the screen, we talk about certification documents, learning outcomes, examinations, the courseware, and below that we talk about the material, whether white papers or additional publications that are all going to be part of that, in quote, new TOGAF library. And all of these basically to support and or to answer, of course, the user organizations, the service providers, the suppliers, and any additional groups that could be either academic or influencers or standard oriented organizations, right? So the ecosystem in its entirety will eventually be under multiple languages that will support and enable the industry at large. So with that in mind, the TOGAF library now includes, as you see in the center of the diagram, we have the actual TOGAF standard, but not the monolithic approach anymore. On the left-hand side, there is what we call the series guides, which used to be part of the main or part of the core, but now they're separated as additional documents. So business scenario and how you build it, value stream and what it means, and what value chain means, and how you use it in support of TOGAF or enterprise architecture, your reference models, the TRM and the 3IRM, the service-oriented architecture, the security side, and so on. They're all under what we call TOGAF series guide, right? On the right-hand side, you have other guides now, things that will support items like business capabilities, governance, leaders guides, risk and security. So what is the difference between what we call series guide and guide? Series guide is, as I mentioned earlier, the items that have undergone the same rigorous assessment that the core knowledge has gone through, where guide is not as stringent or not as strict in the assessment protocol that they basically went under. Collectively, all of this is your TOGAF library. So if you notice, on the left-hand side, we're saying modest changes to TOGAF standard that were done or were introduced via the series guide, where other guides that were extensive additions, right, to the library. So these things were not part of the original library, and now they are, right? For those of you who are familiar with TOGAF, this is what I call TOGAF big picture. On the left-hand side, when we're looking at business visions and drivers, this is where we are now. On the right-hand side, future or targeted business capabilities, and this is the desired state. So in order to reach the desired state, to go from where we are now to the desired state, you need to follow the TOGAF framework. So as you take a look at the center of the diagram, there are different colored boxes that reflect the different components of the framework. I want you to start at the orange box, in the middle, the big orange box we call architecture development method. This is the heart of TOGAF. This is basically a set of 9 phases plus the preliminary phase that makes them 10. Basically the different phases or stages of the cycle of developing, governing, implementing, managing your architecture, right? So that's part 2. Part 1 is usually an introduction, so it's not a big deal. Part 3 is what we call ADM guidelines and techniques. So in other words, how you're gonna structure, how you're gonna develop, how you're gonna introduce, how you're gonna control the architecture. You follow certain techniques, right? That's part 3. Part 4 is the content framework. So what is the minimum set of product, if you want to call it outputs, or the minimum set of outputs that you're going to generate from the ADM activities? I don't know, I'm new to this, I'm confused, then you follow the architecture content framework. The enterprise continuum and tools is basically the, if you wish to compare it to the logical view of what the tool gonna look like, and then the actual physical perspective of what the tool is or going to be, right? So in addition to all of this, of course, there is the reference material and the TOGAF library, as I showed you a little bit earlier. So we're doing all of these colorful boxes in the bottom 2/3 of the screen in effort to establish what we call architecture capability framework at the top, right? So collectively, all of those are, as I said, the component of your enterprise architecture based on TOGAF. Couple of new items here for those of you who are familiar with this. As an example, TOGAF reference material and TOGAF library, that's a new item. At the top, instead of saying architecture framework, now it's architecture capability framework, right? So a couple of new titles associated with the different components of the framework. So there is an architecture style that you're going to follow, you know, in the TOGAF library. The TOGAF library talks about, you know, numerous different ways of doing enterprise architecture. We're going to see this in a second. So the library also includes the standards, the series guides, the guides, and the white paper. So the standard is, as I said, the components associated with TOGAF or what constitute TOGAF. The series guidance are those supporting documents that are now part of the body of knowledge, right? The guides, supporting documentation, right, to provide maybe additional best practices or advice, if you wish, right? And the white paper, so from lesson learned that you can bring into the collection of knowledge into the library as well. So this is what the TOGAF library is showing you. The TOGAF library has two main views. One is what we call internal view, which is related to the members of the Open Group Forum. And then there is the public view or the public version that everybody else is going to see. So the internal view gives you a little bit more insight on dependencies, on what documents go where and how you're going to use them, versus the public view, which is pretty much accessible from the Open Group website in order for you to be able to locate resources and use them in a practical way as you are introducing and or implementing TOGAF. So straightforward, even if you go to Google and you go opengroup.org, you'll get to this website. Under publication, you go to the TOGAF library for those additional documentation. So as you can see, examples is under different categories. There are different types of documentation that you can access. And, you know, if you click on each one of them, you'll see a series of documents included in the library to enable and or support your activities. So, overview of the library. If you take a look at the diagram, you're going to notice a number of very important aspects. The center of the diagram, the ADM, that is the heart of TOGAF. Without it, there is no TOGAF. All right? And then as you go around that center, you see guidelines and technique, you see architecture content architecture framework, capability framework, enterprise continuum. But outside the dotted lines of the big box, you start seeing additional, right? The series guides, the standards, the blogs, the pocket guides, the reference cards, and so on and so forth, which are all right, although part of the library, but they are additional, as I said, kind of advisory type of information or knowledge to enable you have more input or better results in your architecture practice. So the library itself includes the foundation documents. Again, these are the bases, includes the generic guidance and techniques, so different architecture styles and how you follow TOGAF. It includes industry-specific guidance and techniques. So as an example, how can you use TOGAF in multiple verticals within the industry? And the last, or the last on this slide anyway, organization-specific guidance. So basically, how TOGAF was applied in a specific type of environment, right? So in the library, you have two dimensions. When we talk about the continuum and we talk about, the coupling, to the standard. And we're going to see this, in other words, we'll see what it means. And here it is. So the top portion of the diagram is when we're talking about, the continuum. The bottom portion of the diagram is when we talk about the coupling with different industries. So what does this all mean? This is actually very important if you are a practitioner of enterprise architecture. First of all, the continuum is representing different architectural styles, okay? Whereby the first one to the left, when we say foundation architecture, this relates to a broad application of enterprise architecture in the industry at large. In other words, it doesn't really matter what kind of business, right? This is applicable. This is the basic where you can start from. But then we go to common system architecture. So this is now generic and is applicable to areas where, as an example, you're using something like CRMs or ERMs and so on. So it's describing certain architecture styles that could be adapted with a certain characteristics or more specific needs or context. Industry architecture, this is associated with different verticals, meaning that this style will be applicable to something like maybe a financial industry or defense industry or health industry and so on. And finally, organization-specific architecture that describe, right, how it can be or how the standard can be applied to your specific needs and details of your business. So although these are 4 different styles, and they are correlated, if you wish, or maybe applicable to the 4 different applications at the bottom, right? You still can evolve from one to another. So you are starting from the very left, where is the basis, and you can evolve over time, to the very specific detailed architecture on the right. This is a very important concept that is basically is going to be supporting your business, depending, of course, as to how you're going to generate or how you're going to follow the TOGAF approach using your architecture development method cycle. So when we're talking about tightness of coupling to the standard, right? In some cases, again, the same description or the same explanation, from dependent to supporting to general, right? So basically going back to these boxes at the bottom of the diagram, that gives you an idea as to where you may be applying each one of these architecture styles, if you wish, right? So the list here is, how should I say this? The list here is new items in the library that you need to familiarize yourself with. So for those of you who are actual architecture practitioners, these are elements that we are concerned about as part of developing the architecture. So the business scenario, as an example, will help you identify the business requirements for architecture, right? Also, you can deduct from that your stakeholders, value stream or value streams, right? So as you deliver a certain result at the end of the day, you are undertaking a number of different interconnected, dependent activities that is based on your business capability, as a matter of fact. So there's discussion about the value stream, there's discussion about the business capability, there will be discussions on risk and security, there will be discussion on governance, and especially governing service-oriented architecture, just to mention a few. Notice towards the third bullet from the bottom, when we talk about practitioner approach to using or following the ADM. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have architecture development method, then you don't have an enterprise architecture delivery of any sort, because that's what you're going to follow in order to deliver it. So this is an example of business scenario, and at least the main sections of the business scenario, right? Identify your problem, understand your environment, whether the business or technology, what are your value chains, your business capabilities, what outcome do you expect, and you follow a couple of approaches. One major approach is the SMART approach. Who are the actors, whether they are human or system actors? So your business scenario, right, approach will describe the method, right? And of course, this was an original part of 9.1, and now they separated it as a separate, document altogether. The link is on the screen for those of you who want to be able to access and or download. Value stream, as I mentioned, interconnected set of activities supported by your business capabilities. So as an example, how to identify, define, model, map, right? Your value stream to different components of your architecture, right? So that's an example, right? Again, the document with the link, right? The business capability, describe what you can and cannot do. And this actually will be most useful when you transform it into a heat map. So in other words, you give it some colors like red, orange, and green as an example, where red is failing, orange is kind of on borderline, and green is doing good. So once you translate this into a heat map, you will very quickly understand within your business, if you call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Risk and security, right, also has its new publication, and it shows you the linkage to the ADM. It shows you the linkage to different aspects of information security management, as well as enterprise risk management, and where within the ADM you are tapping to these activities, right? Very important to find out. And of course, there is a document associated with that that will explain the overall approach, and of course will highlight information security management and enterprise risk management. All of this is associated with the risk, or rather, to be more accurate, the security architecture section of the TOGAF standard. In terms of service orientation, right? Also, there is a document that is going to be associated with what is service-oriented architecture, its quality, its integration, its information, its governance, right? So we talk about all of that. And of course, you know, from the service-oriented governance that I talked about a little bit earlier, you're going to be using, you know, this governance model to control and to manage the service-oriented architecture style, right? There is another leader guide, you know, a leader's guide to establish and improve your enterprise architecture capability. So basically, you have your generic or general business capabilities, but still you need some more specific, right, architecture capabilities that is associated with supporting strategy, supporting portfolio, supporting projects, and eventually supporting solution delivery. So if you take a look at these colored boxes, you know, they are actually associated with the architecture development method, but of course, we don't have the time to go through all of the explanation for now. And you need to keep in mind your basic or foundational capabilities in support of that as well. So the leader's guide gives you a certain mindset, right? Or certain guidance, to be more accurate, on the guide set that you need to have an effort to establish your enterprise architecture capability based on this model, all right? Based on this model, okay? So when we're talking about the practitioner and the practitioner approach, right? You notice that we're using the same capability cycle, but supporting these capabilities also, there is a financial life cycle that needs to be there, from budget planning to preparation to allocation and to control. So from the very beginning, when we're talking about strategy, this is where you start planning your budget. When we're talking about portfolio, this is when you're preparing your budget, and then support project, allocating the budget, and eventually delivery project, where you are spending and you want to control the budget. So you need to consider this from an enterprise architecture practitioner approach, especially when you are using the ADM cycle or the ADM model. Something to remind you, and this is one of the reasons as to why actually they kind of revamped TOGAF as we speak. The last version of TOGAF was introduced in, if my memory doesn't fail me, 2007, 2008 type of thing, right? So all of these discussions that we already have had, right, they're 10 years old. And I'll leave it to your imagination in terms of the changes in the IT industry over the last 10 years. If you would have told me about Internet of Things 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have said that you're crazy. Well, today they are using Internet of Things, you know, even against you if you committed a crime, because it's a gadget that's sitting at your place, right? You call it Alexa or call it whatever else that you want to call it, a Google device or whatever. that is listening, that is monitoring, that it's kind of waiting for you to give it an order of some sort, and you know what? You committed a crime and it recorded it. So now it can be a witness against you. So if you would have said that this, item would be part of the technology 5 years ago, people would have thought that we're crazy, right? Give it an order to turn on or off your lights or whatever. All of this within the context of the TOGAF that we call 9.1 is 10 years old. So the reference models that we are using or we're still using, they are actually 10 years old. So they may not be totally, up to date with today's technology. So if I'm talking about a technical reference model, or if I'm talking about an application reference model, right? I'm using the basis of an older consideration, where now I need something fresh, I need something up to date. So even though the concept is valid, but the content of the concept need to be updated as well. So the reference models that we have had and we still have are also separated from the core publication onto separate publications, including the integrated information infrastructure reference model. All right. This is a quick view of your technical reference model. So the green portion is what we call platform that supports your applications, infrastructure application and business application. And of course, there is an interface between them. And the same at the bottom, there is another interface between the platform and the communication infrastructure. So although the concept is a sound concept, but the platform items have changed and evolved and were added to, etc. So what we see in this TRM is not 100% accurate anymore. All right. So again, the same discussion, the model is a sound model, and we need to have it. Every organization need to have the technical reference, because this is your, remember when I talked earlier about your foundational architecture? Well, this is your foundational architecture model. All right. Again, this is about the age of what's in there, right? And I already covered about that. Now, there is in the new setup the badges, right? The certification badges. So this is actually very beneficial for you once you get certified as a TOGAF architecture or architect, right? You can claim or use, in quote, the acclaim badge, where you can actually use it for multiple levels, for multiple certifications, and you can post it in your email signature or on LinkedIn or tweets or whatever, so that you identify or you get identified immediately that you have an expertise, right, as a TOGAF certified person, right? So this is new as well. So the certification body of knowledge, again, if you take a closer look to the body of knowledge for TOGAF now, right, we've got at the top left certification program definition, whereby there is certain conformance requirements that needs to be met by what we call learning points and learning outcomes that are coming from all the TOGAF body of knowledge associated with the series and the guides and the core and so on and so forth. So this is merely to tell you or to show you where the content of the body of knowledge is coming in from, right, as a series guide and core guide, and where the examination or what the examination gonna kind of look at in that body of knowledge. The same story here, right? And here, right? So a couple of slides to talk about that. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the ADM, that is what the ADM looks like. And the ADM activities, I'm gonna zoom quickly through it because of the time constraints. So in preliminary, this is preparation for your architecture project. And then in phase A, this is where you are establishing architecture vision, business scenario, target architecture, right? In B, in C, and in D, this is where you are developing your architecture. In E and in F, this is where you're establishing your solution architecture based on what you have developed earlier. And this is where you set up your project plan on how you're going to implement your architecture in a physical environment. And the next phase, it's hidden with the arrow. That's what we call governance, implementation governance. So how you're going to control the live environment and how you're going to apply changes in H. In the middle, of course, requirement management. That is the heart of this activity, and without it, there will be no architecture need, right? So with that in mind, there are additional consideration about business attributes, requirements engineering, also SAPSA. For those of you who don't know SAPSA, it's a security institute, so that consideration as well. And of course, the relationship between all the phases, it's a bidirectional relationship to requirement management, right? And we flow. If you take a look at this carefully, A is pretty much about, if you want to call it strategy. B, C, and D is about development of the architecture. E and F, this is about the solution and the project plan. And G and H is about governance and control. That's in a nutshell your ADM. And of course, you can consider the ADM for security-related topics as well. As part of the new changes, the items in the boxes, those are new items, either to improve the content framework or to streamline it, right? So as you now notice, as an example, that if you take a look in the green and in the grayish next to it, data entity and then information system, technology service, the same thing below that, logical data, logical application component, logical technology, and so on. So there is more streamlining. This is the model or the meta model that identified the minimal product that you should generate from the ADM. So if you go back here and you say, I'm confused, I don't know what to generate from each one of these bubbles, this diagram will tell you. So under business architecture, you're going to generate all what's in the blue boxes, right? So go back here, business architecture is phase B. So in B, you are generating everything that you see in here. This is the same, but in a different view. And this is the same, but with the view of relationships now between the different objects that you are considering within your enterprise architecture considerations. This is the same, but these are actually the objects themselves. So all these boxes in colors and in white that we see here, these are now the objects that you're gonna basically develop and fulfill, right? Potentially you may have templates already for them, or you are creating or generating them based on the activity that you're gonna undertake. So again, these items, you're starting here, you're deciding on what the output gonna be here, and in order to show relationships and in order to show specific details on each artifact. And of course, you're going to need a repository or some sort of a tool to put all of the above in it. The pinkish boxes on the left, they used to be outside the scope of the architecture repository. They brought it in. And now it's basically considering not only what you see in the ADM specifically, but also what you're going to see as a result in terms of solutions and or requirements. On the right-hand side, you've got the external type of industry models and or standards that you can steal and borrow, if and when you need to apply a certain architecture to a certain industry. All right. So this is pretty much the changes associated with TOGAF 9.1. The next step for you is basically to speak with Starweaver to set up a seat in your training so that you can get the appropriate detailed information, and eventually you can do your assessment to get the certification for 9.2 and to command more money and better positions in your organization and or in the industry at large. And again, don't forget your acclaim badge, either for TOGAF as the standard or for the TOGAF Essentials, which is considered to be the bridge between 9.1 and 9.2 from a knowledge perspective.
We are Starweaver, education you can bank on. For more information, contact us.